China makes too many cars and the world is increasingly okay with it. That's how Bloomberg frames China's car exports. According to the latest data from the China Association of Automobile Manufacturers, total vehicle exports in the first 2 months of this year reached over 1.35 million units, marking a year-on-year increase of nearly 50%. That's almost 1,000 new cars exported from China every hour. Now, new energy vehicles, or NEVs, led the surge, with exports accounting for more than 40% of the total. So every hour, almost 400 NEVs depart China. How to make sense of these numbers? What's fueling this hyper-accelerated growth? Why are Chinese vehicles increasingly embraced around the world? Welcome to this edition of The Point with me, Li Xin, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined from Shenzhen, southern China, by Carl Fei, Professor of Strategy at BI Norwegian Business School in Oslo. From Minneapolis, the U.S., by Xing Lei, co-host of the podcast China EVs and More, and here in the studio by Li Lun, Assistant Professor of Economics at Peking University. The warmest welcome to all of you, gentlemen. First of all, let's take a closer look at the numbers. Now, in the first 2 months of 2026, China exported 1.35 million vehicles, an increase of almost 50% year on year, as I said. And NEV cars account for over 40% of that, some 600,000 units. That's an increase of 110% year on year. Meanwhile, traditional combustion engine vehicle exports grew by 22%. So let me go to Professor Carl Fei there. What are we seeing?
Well, I think we're seeing, EVs around the world becoming more popular. I think initially people were somewhat skeptical to buy a Chinese product that was so expensive, wondering if the quality would be there. But they're seeing that Chinese EVs actually are really quite good. And this now is giving confidence to people to buy Chinese EVs. I'm based in Oslo, Norway, and Norway now has the world's largest percentage of EV sales. 98% of all new car sales in Norway are actually EVs. And Chinese EVs are becoming increasingly popular. In fact, one of the things that's helped Norway have such a high percentage of EVs is that they have not put an additional high tax on Chinese EVs, unlike most of Europe and the United States. I think the other thing that has helped Chinese EVs is that they are really ahead in terms of features. So they've been doing really quick development and having better features than other places. But probably the weakness that Chinese EVs need to work on is further increasing their brand awareness. That's the Achilles heel of Chinese EVs at the moment.
Mr. Xing Lei, what is your take on the picture? Do you agree with Professor Fei's assessment? And also, among NEVs, the Chinese-made battery electric vehicles, or BEVs, and plug-in hybrids, or PHEVs, both seem to be doing well, especially the growth of PHEVs, the plug-in hybrids, growing by 120%. What's fueling this?
Yeah, I think the key word that Carl mentioned is popularity. I'd like to add a few more T's that I've mentioned before: affordability, quality, availability, and just feature, right? And the world over the last few years have had an experience with Chinese EVs, and they know how good they are. So that's number one. But actually, coming back to the numbers, I know you're going to share a lot of the numbers, but we're at the beginning of the year, and having covered the Chinese auto industry for a long time, we always have that kind of lull at the beginning of the year due to the seasonality issues. So the domestic market tends to be slowed down a bit, whereas the rest of the world, we're still pushing, right? And so you see this kind of discrepancy, but I like to wait until we make some of the conclusions, maybe until after Q1, and going into the early, spring, summer months to see those percentages, where they go from here.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, 2 months, it doesn't say much. Nevertheless, the numbers are pretty impressive, especially compared with the background for the whole year 2025. For instance, China's total vehicle exports grew by 30%, and now we're only in the first 2 months of this year, and that number jumped to almost 50%. Professor Lee, what are you reading here? Is the trend picking up, or is it too early to tell?
I think it's definitely picking up, and especially not only for the NEVs, we're also seeing, as you mentioned, the combustion engine, the traditional vehicle is also picking up a 22% increase annually. So I think that is representing some of the cost advantage, some of the innovation of Chinese automakers are going to spill over to the traditional industry as well. And for some emerging markets, people are not thinking about whether I should drive a traditional vehicle or EV. They're mostly thinking, what's the most affordable way to buy a vehicle. So in that sense, Chinese automakers can also provide an alternative option, providing all of these traditional combustion engine vehicles. That's also going to be helpful for the local consumers. And I think the reason behind this uptaking trend is that we have built up the entire ecosystem, not only our production capability, but also the charging network. So we're exporting not only the product, but the entire lifestyle, the entire infrastructure that's associated with EV. And also we're also preparing, producing other alternatives like the traditional combustion engine vehicles. So that's providing the entire product chain for consumers.
What is this putting the competitors? For instance, China has been the world's largest producer and exporter of cars, including NEVs. Actually, the number of cars that China exports is equals to the combined total of the second and third place, which is Japan and Germany. So, Professor Carl Fei, what is going to be the picture of these kind of ranking as we go forward?
Well, I think Chinese EVs are going to continue to be strong. As I said, the key issue is that their customers are getting more confident in them, and I don't think that's going to do anything but increase because it is an excellent product. It's a much better product than the reputation. So I think we're going to see that moving forward. Chinese EV manufacturers have done a couple of smart things. Number one, they've been quick to get lots of features. Number two, they have put a lot of focus on some inexpensive models for countries like in South America, Africa, Middle East, which has been really successful. Number three, they've realized that the entire world doesn't have as good infrastructure as China does. And that's the reason that these hybrids have been doing really well, because if you don't have charging stations everywhere, well, you may be a little bit hesitant to buy an EV. So that's been one issue. The other thing that Chinese EV manufacturers have been doing in recent years is, especially let's say even over the last year, is really expanding the manufacturing facilities overseas. So, for example, BYD's factory in Hungary is making people in Europe feel sort of a little happier about buying a Chinese EV, but one that is produced in Europe. And we also see that, for example, with the building of a facility in Brazil to get around the tariff problems of importing into Mexico and then on to the US. So I think we're going to see Chinese EVs' position continue to strengthen. And of course, some people are going to criticize this, saying, well, there was sort of too much subsidy from the government or whatever, and this is what's helping this. But I'd like to remind, if we would have this conversation 10 or 15 years ago, people would be questioning, can anyone produce an EV at a low enough price that people are going to actually buy it? And so I would say, the world should be thanking China for helping the EV industry to develop. so that we can all advance in becoming greener because we're all interconnected, and so this green transition is really important.
Well, a big welcome. You're welcome. Let's take a look at the buyers. Buyers, though, absolutely, they must have been benefiting from these Chinese cars. Hence, the picking up of orders from China. The biggest buyers, if you think about, all types of vehicles. They are Mexico, Russia, UAE, UK, and of course other countries such as Brazil or countries in Southeast Asia. Mr. Xing Lei, why these countries and why in such order? For instance, Mexico comes at the top.
Yeah, so Mexico is quite an interesting case because on January 1st of this year, there was a 50% extra tariff on Chinese-made vehicles and components put in place that's partially pressured from the Trump administration because they're reworking the USMCA agreement. So hence, in 2025, you saw a kind of a spike putting Mexico as the number one export destination. But this year, we don't know if that'll be the case. So I think policy is one area where that was kind of an outlier. But I mean, before that, Mexico was actually quite the consumers there, right? The type of vehicles that are exported there. I was in Cancun last year, and I felt like I was in China because so many of these compact SUVs, affordable, ICE vehicle, not only NEVs, are very popular. They've established a good presence and popularity there. So that's a major reason.
So it's import for the local markets, Mr. Xing.
What was the question?
Yeah, is it mostly imports for the local consumers? Or is there a possibility
Yes.
that somehow these cars may end up because of the interest of American consumers?
That's right. Well, I mean, this is a thorny issue because at the same time that Mexico is under pressure from the Trump administration, they want investment from China. So recently there's rumors about a couple of Chinese companies, BYD, I think was one, acquiring possibly some of the plants operated by Japanese automakers in Mexico. That's kind of at a standstill, but eventually I think anywhere in the world, what you're going to see is produce where you sell, including the U.S.
Interesting. Professor Lee, is that going to be the kind of future trend that we're seeing, not just buying cars from China, but also introducing technology, know-how, investment from China to produce locally? Is that what's going to happen, or do you foresee that the buying export cars from China will continue for a foreseeable period of time?
Yeah, I mean, for countries like Mexico or Brazil or potentially US, but I'm not very hopeful there. I think it's possible, it's likely, including for countries like Hungary, there could be a possibility that some of the production capability locally can satisfy the demand locally. But I think overall, for the majority of the countries, we're at least in the short term, we're still going to observe the pattern that China is going to produce the majority of these vehicles domestically in China, because we are already seeing that the Chinese markets are beginning to show signs of mature. Basically,
saturation.
Yes, exactly. We're seeing the price competition becoming more intensive. So I think in the long term, these Chinese automakers are going to use some of that price advantage, some of that innovation, some of that edge in their technology and apply it overseas, and that's going to be the ultimate goal. So whether we're talking about building more factories in China or building locally, it all depends on the tariffs, it depends on the geopolitical tensions, but overall I think the trend is irreversible, that we're definitely going to sell more EVs made by or in China.
Mr. Xing Lei, according to your observation, is
Sure.
adoption rate a problem? An obstacle for Chinese exports of electric cars?
Well, yeah, I mean, I can take a shot at that question. Obviously, China, I think the latest numbers is like 20 million. I could be wrong, but it's in the tens of millions of chargers, right? Charging piles already as part of the infrastructure, but that's not nearly as much everywhere else in the world. So what you're seeing is the export of actually plugins and a lot of the ICEs. And I think one thing to mention is I think people might be surprised that a lot of the exports, especially of the ICE vehicles, are actually now increasingly coming from the foreign manufacturers, the joint ventures, right? The Fords, the Volkswagens, they're actually exporting some of the ICE vehicles from um, where they're produced in China to other parts of the world. So I think you've seen the kind of the plugins getting more popular. Also for Europe, it's bypassing the current tariff in place. Although discussions are ongoing about minimum pricing,
Right.
and I think we're going to hear more companies maybe getting some kind of approval. Volkswagen Anhui, right, was one of the examples where
Well, right.
they're not a part of the tariff yet. So.
What about the case of Belgium? Belgium is one of the top buyers of Chinese NEVs. Mr. Calfei, can you help us understand the case of Belgium because it is part of EU? It's not the case with the UK. UK is one of the top buyers of Chinese EVs. What about Belgium? Don't they have to worry about the kind of trade friction between China and the EU that's going on?
Yeah, I think there is some challenges there, of course, but they've been doing pretty well. I think Chinese EV manufacturers have spent a lot of effort in trying to build brands there. The other thing that's happened in the EU and in Belgium in particular is that recently there have been a relaxation of the idea to phase out all gas-powered and hybrid cars in the next 10 years or so. And so this has, especially for the hybrid cars, but even for other types of cars, created a little more possibility to buy hybrids now. So that has been one thing that has been really pushing things forward.
What about the kind of cars that are sold as Chinese-made NEVs? Professor Li Lun, help us break it down here. Of course, we have the Chinese brands, right? The BYD, you know, the Xiaomi, you name it. But there are also the foreign funded brands. Help us understand who are the producer of these cars that are being exported.
Yeah, so we are already seeing, for example, when the German Chancellor Merz visited China, some of the most advanced models of Mercedes-Benz is actually here being manufactured here in China as well. So even though I think domestically and abroad we have a lot of Chinese automakers, as you mentioned, because of the fierce competition that's being posed to these traditional car makers. So these car makers, including Mercedes-Benz, including BMW, and also Volkswagen, and also American car makers, are increasingly doubling down in its investments in traditional EVs. So I don't have the exact number of breakdown of how much of them are from Chinese automakers and how much of them are from these foreign ventures or foreign car makers. But I think overall, this very healthy ecosystem, very healthy competition in China is going to promote innovation. It's going to promote the competition in a way that it's going to bring more car models. So that's why I think a lot of times foreign buyers are very interested in Chinese EV, because our whole innovation cycle, so the time between having this concept to fully developing a car model that's being able to sell globally, is as short as 18 months. But in some other countries, that cycle is going to be as long as 5 years. So if we have a short development cycle for products, so I think that's going to also be a good advantage.
Well, you're talking about something that's very interesting, the transfer of Chinese know-how to the former teachers of Chinese producers. But let's set that aside for the time being. Of course, there's a big point of discussion. What is the increasing Chinese export of cars and NEVs going to mean for local producers? But for the time being, since we do not have that much time, Professor Cao Fei, is the war in Iran going to accelerate the popularity, the import of Chinese-made NEV cars?
Well, maybe a little bit. I mean, I guess it depends how long people think it's going to last, and I think many people are hoping it's going to be, rather short-lived. So I'm not sure it'll have a huge effect. But of course, gas has really been going up in price all around, and so you go to the pump, you have to pay much more than before, and so it has, of course, some effect as well. But I think the big effect will be if people think it will last longer.
Mr. Xing, what is your take?
Well, I'm putting my consumer hat on. So I'm switching to an EV in the US, not because of the gas prices, because my calculated experience that it's the right time to switch. But certainly, I think it's going to influence purchase decisions. But I think with respect to the Chinese brands, EVs exporting, being available, I actually don't think that the Iran war at this point will have that much influence. Maybe in the Middle Eastern region, as far as logistics are concerned, that could be an issue that will actually affect sales. But in the broader picture, at this point, I think it's still too early to tell. I think generally the share of exports, the global adoption, the welcoming, the acceptance of Chinese-made EVs are rising. There's no question about that.
Well, don't you think the fact that EVs are less dependent on gasoline, on the certainty or the provision of crude oil as a factor, will probably make people think more to turn to this direction, Xing Lei, to follow your footsteps, let's say?
Yeah, well, we go back to the earlier question of the infrastructure, right? It's a component of the whole ecosystem. If it's not ready, the push from the rising gas prices only play a certain role. So that's what, hence you have the export of products into the Middle Eastern region that are completely different from, let's say, Europe, because the Middle Eastern region, there's less developed infrastructure. That's why you're going to see rising export of these extended range EVs from BYD, Denza. Li Auto is into Kazakhstan, in those regions where their EREVs are very popular, and because of lack of infrastructure, they're almost like a ICE vehicle. So that plays a huge role.
Well, the EVs definitely are very much saving energy, and there are estimates that the use of EVs have actually saved 60% of energy. That's according to an international organization. So Professor Li Lun, certainly that's the direction that China is going to go. And where do you see the whole picture, the world's car industry pivoting in the near future, especially looking at the stranglehold that the world is suffering in terms of the war in Iran?
Yeah, I think right now people are beginning to realize, for some countries more painfully than others, that we can't simply rely on a single mode of transportation, whether it's EV, whether it's combustion engine. I think what Chinese EV are posing to the world is not a substitute, it's another alternative. So instead of relying only on combustion engine, you could also try this new technology. And I think that's what basically whether the battery EVs, BEVs, or the plug-in hybrids are offering. So I think in many countries, especially in the areas that our previous guest mentioned, lags in infrastructure, I think that's where the plug-in hybrids are going to have a bigger markets, because even though, for example, even if you don't charge those vehicles at all, even if you just use gasoline as the only source of energy, those cars are very, very fuel efficient. So when people see their increasing bill of gasoline, they're probably going to think a little bit, maybe it's time to switch to these, more fuel efficient vehicle.
And the difference is very big.
Yes.
If you think about it, I mean, when I talk to people who switched from traditional vehicles to the difference is huge. Another thing, Professor Carl, let me go to you. China actually sold almost every car it produced last year. It produced about 34 million cars, everything, and it sold about 34 million cars. So what does that say about this whole talk of overcapacity?
Well, I think we're starting to see, this get supply and demand get more in balance, and there's good reasons for this. One of the things I'd like to stress is that traditionally in many industries, China has been a follower in technology. In the EV industry, China is a leader in technology. I was recently at BYD's factory in Shenzhen, and I saw a really interesting demonstration where they took two batteries, one battery that was a BYD battery and one from another manufacturer. They were trying to drive a nail into each of these batteries. And the one from the other manufacturer, it became extremely hot, about 500 degrees Celsius, burst into flames and smoke. And then they did the same thing for the BYD one, and it didn't really go up in temperature much at all. No smoke, you could still touch it, etc. So what we're seeing is, a focus on safety, a focus on new technology, and China is becoming a real leader, and that's one of the reasons that people are getting excited about purchasing Chinese EVs.
Yeah, well, actually, only 1 in 5 cars, new EVs built in China, or 1 in 5 cars built in China are sold abroad, which means there are hundreds of millions of Chinese consumers who are testing out these cars before they're sold to overseas markets. So I wouldn't worry too much about safety records. The Chinese will be the #1 witness to it, and they will not be happy if these cars are not built well and safe. By the way, for the past half hour while we talked, about 1,000 Chinese-made cars have gone abroad, among them about 400 NEVs. That's the kind of speed we're talking about. Anyway, let's wrap up the discussion. Many thanks to Carl Fei, Xing Lei, and Li Lun for sharing with us your insights, as usual. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got The Point.